Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Radical Hope: Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation by Jonathan Lear, narrated by Paul Heitsch. 1. After this, nothing happened. A peculiar vulnerability. Shortly before he died, Coups, the last great chief of the Crow Nation, reached out across the clash of civilizations and told his story to a white man. Frank B. Linderman had come to Montana in 1885 as a teenager, and he became a trapper, hunter, and cowboy. He lived in a cabin in the woods near Flathead Lake and was intimately associated with the Crows. From the book he wrote, recounting Coups' story, it is clear that he and Coups had become friends. "I am glad I have told you these things, sign talker," Coups says at the end of the book. "You have felt my heart, and I have felt yours. I know you will tell only what I have said, that your writing will be straight, like your tongue, and I will sign your paper with my thumb, so that your people and mine will know I told you the things you have written down." It is a marvelous account of the exploits of a young man growing up at a time when the Crow were still a vibrant tribe of nomadic hunters. Even so, Linderman is reticent about how well he has got to know his subject. In the foreword he says, "I am convinced that no white man has ever thoroughly known the Indian, and such a work as this must suffer because of the widely different views of life held by the two races, red and white. I have studied the Indian for more than 40 years, not coldly but with sympathy. Yet even now I do not feel that I know much about him. He has told me many times that I do know him, that I have felt his heart, but whether this is so I am not certain." But the words that haunt me are not part of Coups' story, though they do come from his mouth. In an author's note at the end of the book, Linderman says that he was unable to get Coups to talk about anything that had happened after the Crow were confined to a reservation. Coups refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo, so that his story seems to have been broken off, leaving many years unaccounted for. "I have not told you half of what happened when I was young," he said, when urged to go on. "I can think back and tell you much more of war and horse-stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere. Besides," he added sorrowfully, "you know that part of my life as well as I do. You saw what happened to us when the buffalo went away." After this, nothing happened. What could Coups' utterance mean? If we take him at his word, he seems to be saying that there was an event or a happening, the buffaloes going away, something Coups can refer to as a this, such that after this there are no more happenings. Or, to get the temporality correct, Coups came to see, as he looked back, that there was a moment such that after this nothing happened. It would seem to be the retrospective declaration of a moment when history came to an end. But what could it mean for history to exhaust itself? The question is so odd that there is a natural inclination to interpret Coups as saying something that makes more immediate sense to us. One possibility is to focus on Coups' claim that after the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. As he puts it, there was little singing anywhere. This might suggest a psychological interpretation. After the buffalo went away, after they were confined to a reservation, the Crow people became depressed. Things ceased to matter to them. It was for them as though nothing happened. This psychological interpretation is given added support by the author's account of Coups adding sorrowfully, "Besides, you know that part of my life as well as I do." In general, it is an astonishing claim for anyone to say that another person knows a part of his adult life as well as he himself does. Although we may be corrected in various ways by others, we take ourselves to have authority when it comes to the narratives of our own lives. Plenty Coups seems to be abdicating this authority when it comes to this period. Indeed, he seems to suggest that anyone, not just the author, who saw what happened when the buffalo went away, would be competent to tell that part of his life as well as he could. That is, any competent third-person observer would know all there was to know. This suggests that, according to Plenty Coups, there is no importantly first-person narrative to tell of this period. It is as though there is no longer an I there. This strange thought is made sense of by saying, Plenty Coups is depressed, or he is giving voice to the depression that engulfed his tribe. This interpretation has the merit of making sense, and it is plausible. Plenty Coups might have been giving voice to a malaise that infected his tribe. The interpretation thus fits what philosophers call the principle of humanity, that we should try to interpret others as saying something true, guided by our own sense of what is true, and of what they could reasonably believe. But note, we have gained plausibility in interpretation by changing the subject matter. Ostensibly, Plenty Coups is making a claim about the world, that after a certain point nothing happened. We have interpreted him as saying something true by taking him to be expressing something about his psyche and the psyches of his fellow Crow tribesmen. This may fit the principle of humanity, but there is a question of whether it fits Plenty Coups' humanity. Might he not be giving utterance to a darker thought, one that is more difficult for us to understand? If so, then the psychological interpretation is in too much of a rush. If he is talking about the Crow people becoming depressed, we can understand him in a minute and move on. But if he is talking about happenings coming to an end, how can we interpret him as saying something true? Certainly, there is evidence to suggest that Plenty Coups was not depressed, and thus that we ought to interpret him in some other way. When we consider the rest of his life, it is extraordinary how active Plenty Coups was. And while it is true that some depressed people can keep busy, as a way of warding off the experience of depression, there was a kind of enthusiasm in Plenty Coups' activity that belies this interpretation. He avidly took up farming life and urged other members of his tribe to do so. With apparent pride, he displayed his crops at agricultural shows and won prizes. He was active in bringing other Crow chiefs together to form a united front in negotiating with the U.S. government. As a young leader, he traveled to Washington, D.C. as the head of a Crow delegation that successfully lobbied to prevent a bill that would appropriate more Crow land from coming to the Senate floor. This was the first of several trips he made to Washington, defending the rights of the Crow. Plenty Coups visited George Washington's house at Mount Vernon and became fascinated with the idea of donating his own home to the nation. It is now a state park in Montana. And in 1921, at the national ceremony to establish the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery, Plenty Coups was chosen to represent the Indian Americans who had fought in World War I. He actively encouraged young Crow to acquire the white man's education and even to be open to their religion. These do not seem to be the acts of a depressed person. Yet this is the period of which Plenty Coups said, "Nothing happened." It is the period in which, as he put it, "You know that part of my life as well as I do." I cannot pretend to say with confidence what Plenty Coups really meant. His remark is enigmatic in part because it is compatible with so many different interpretations. Some of them are superficial. Others delve into the heart of the human condition. Plenty Coups might have just been giving his interlocutor the brush-off, casually saying that, after this, there is nothing worth talking about. But what if his remark went deeper? What if it gave expression to an insight into the structure of temporality? That at a certain point things stopped happening. What would he have meant if he meant that? This is the question I want to address in this chapter. It is thus an inquiry into a possibility. What might plenty coups have meant? The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard has said that if there were a genuine knight of faith in our midst, we would be unlikely to recognize him. In terms of outward appearance, he is just another one of our neighbors taking a stroll in the park. In a similar vein, what if plenty coups were witness to the breakdown of happenings? What would he be witnessing? What would it be to interpret him as something more than an old chief nostalgic for a bygone past? The question is what it would be for plenty coups to be a witness to a peculiar form of human vulnerability. If there is a genuine possibility of happenings breaking down, it is one with which we all live. We are familiar with the thought that as human creatures we are by nature vulnerable to bodily injury, disease, aging, death, and all sorts of insults from environment. But the vulnerability we are concerned with here is of a different order. We seem to acquire it as a result of the fact that we essentially inhabit a way of life. Humans are by nature cultural animals. We necessarily inhabit a way of life that is expressed in a culture. But our way of life, whatever it is vulnerable in various ways. And we, as participants in that way of life, thereby inherit a vulnerability. Should that way of life break down, that is our problem. The suggestion I want to explore in this chapter is that if our way of life collapsed, things would cease to happen. What could this mean? And there is another aspect to our question that I want to explore. What would it be to be a witness to this breakdown? Plenty coups seems to have become entangled in his culture's history in an extraordinary way. Obviously, he lived through a period in which the Crow abandoned their traditional nomadic hunting way of life. But he seems to have become a spokesman from inside that way of life for the death of that way of life. What gave him such authority to speak for the way of life? Did he assume responsibility for it? And if so, how? In virtue of what did he become the designated mourner? We live at a time of a heightened sense that civilizations are themselves vulnerable. Events around the world, terrorist attacks, violent social upheavals, and even natural catastrophes have left us with an uncanny sense of menace. We seem to be aware of a shared vulnerability that we cannot quite name. I suspect that this feeling has provoked the widespread intolerance that we see around us today from all points on the political spectrum. It is as though, without our insistence that our outlook is correct, the outlook itself might collapse. Perhaps, if we could give a name to our shared sense of vulnerability, we could find better ways to live with it. This, then, is a work of philosophical anthropology. Unlike an anthropological study, I am not primarily concerned with what actually happened to the Crow tribe or to any other group. I am concerned rather with the field of possibilities in which all human endeavors gain meaning. This is basically an ethical inquiry into how one should live in relation to a peculiar human possibility. But it also has what philosophers call an ontological dimension. If we are going to think about how to live with this possibility, we need to figure out what it is. What is this possibility of things ceasing to happen? This is not, as Aristotle would call it, an inquiry that is proper to any of the special sciences. It is neither a work of anthropology, nor of psychology, nor of history. I do not pretend to pronounce on the deepest truths about the Crow, in particular whether things really ceased to happen for them. The inquiry is rather into what it would be if it were true that after a certain point nothing happened. To that end, I do rely on the invaluable historical and anthropological research on the Crow as well as on oral histories, not because I want to fill out the picture of what happened to them, that is the task for some future Crow historian or anthropologist, but because I think the only satisfactory way to investigate this remarkable human possibility is to locate it in a textured historical context. The Crow actually did endure a cultural catastrophe, and looking at their actual experience may make it somewhat easier to grasp this elusive possibility of things ceasing to happen. But the possibility that concerns me is not the special province of this or any other culture. It is a vulnerability that we all share simply in virtue of being human. It should now be clear why a straightforward anthropological interpretation of Pletiku's words will not give us what we are looking for. On the anthropological interpretation, Pletiku's is saying that after a certain decisive event or set of events, the disappearance of the buffalo, being confined to a reservation, a traditional way of life came to an end. Anthropologists and historians have given us insightful accounts of what it is like for people to have to endure a breakdown in their way of life. Again, this interpretation, like the psychological interpretation before it, has the advantage of interpreting Pletiku's as saying something plausible, and of saying something he could have plausibly believed. But on this interpretation, Pletiku's is speaking a kind of shorthand. He isn't really saying that at a certain point things stopped happening. He is giving voice to the idea that a traditional form of life ended. But what we want to know is, what is it about a form of life's coming to an end that makes it such that for the inhabitants of that life, things cease to happen? Not just that it would seem to them that things ceased to happen, but what it would be for things to cease happening. The anthropologist Marshall Sahlins has said that an event becomes such as it is interpreted. Only as it is appropriated in and through a cultural scheme does it acquire historical significance. Thus, he can claim that history is culturally ordered, differently so in different societies, according to meaningful schemes of things. So, if we think of happenings as being given to Pletiku's in terms of the schema of traditional Crow life, with the breakdown of that life, one might well expect a similar threat to what had traditionally been counted as a happening. The anthropological interpretation of Pletiku's words thus seems plausible. But what does this mean? What are the conditions of its being possible? A philosophical inquiry may rely on historical and anthropological accounts of how a traditional culture actually came to an end, but ultimately it wants to know not about actuality, but about possibility. What is this possibility of things ceasing to happen? If this is a possibility, it is a possibility we all must live with. Even when our culture is robust, even if we never have to face its becoming actual. It is a possibility that marks us as human. How should we live with it? This question points to another difference between a philosophical inquiry and a regular empirical inquiry. Ultimately, it is concerned with ought rather than is. If this is a human possibility, philosophy, in its ethical dimension, wants to know, how ought we to live with it? So it is one thing to give an account of the circumstances in which a way of life actually collapses. It is another to give an account of what it would be for it to collapse. And it is yet another to ask, how ought we to live with this possibility of collapse? There is an important ambiguity in the words, a way of life comes to an end. And this ambiguity keeps us in the dark about what anyone might mean when he claims that, after this, nothing happened. We are trying to grasp an extreme possibility of human existence, in part so that we can grasp the scope and limits of human possibilities. Thus, we want to try to understand the person making this claim, after this, as making as radical a claim as is humanly possible. And we want to ask, what would it be for such a claim to be true? Protecting a way of life. The Crow had no conscious understanding of this peculiar vulnerability that we are trying to track. Thus, insofar as it hit them, they were not in a position to see it coming. That is, they were not in a position to understand the significance of what it was they were about to endure. We are in a somewhat better position than the Crow were. We are a literate culture that has a history of reflecting on the phenomenon of civilizations collapsing. But still, we are largely in the dark about what it would be for things to stop happening. If we reflect on how the Crow defended themselves in general, we may be able to gain insight into how they happened to protect themselves, perhaps unwittingly, against this peculiar possibility. For as long as they could sustain themselves as a vibrant tribe, they thereby held this possibility at bay. And perhaps the special circumstances of their collapse will bring this possibility to light. The Crow were a nomadic, hunting, warrior tribe. The Crow historian Joseph Medicine Crow has hypothesized that they came into existence instantaneously. Their ancestors, the Hidatsa, had lived along the Mississippi River at the beginning of the 16th century and had migrated during that century to North Dakota. One of the chiefs, No Vitals, had a vision in which he received sacred tobacco seeds from the Great Spirit, who told him to go west to high mountains to plant them. There they would flourish. For a while, No Vitals and his followers settled with the Mandan along the Missouri River, but then they split off to find their promised land. When No Vitals left, he started out afresh as a brand new tribe without a name. He literally and symbolically decided to travel light, for he left all heavy impedimenta behind him for good. His band became an instant tribe capable of existing as a separate and distinct entity, and one motivated with desire and dream of someday receiving the blessings of the Great Spirit when it reached the Promised Land. The details of their migration are fascinating and contested, but it is generally agreed that by 1700 they were settled in what is now Montana and Wyoming. To survive as a nomadic tribe, they had to be good hunters, but they also had to be good at protecting themselves against rival tribes, notably the Sioux, the Blackfeet, and the Cheyenne. Fighting battles, defending one's territory, preparing to go to war, all this permeated the Crow way of life. The Crow were and are known to themselves as Absaroki, which literally means children of the large-beaked bird. French trappers and traders took that bird to be a crow, and thus named the tribe Les Corbeaux. It is generally thought that the Europeans misidentified the bird, though its exact identity remains uncertain. Robert Lowy, an anthropologist who visited the Crow at the turn of the 20th century and recorded the memories of those who could remember the old way of life, described the situation this way. War was not the concern of a class, nor even of the male sex, but of the whole population from cradle to grave. Girls as well as boys derived their names from a famous man's exploit. Women danced wearing scalps, derived honor from their husbands' deeds, publicly exhibited the men's shield or weapons, and a woman's lamentations over a slain son was the most effective goad to a punitive expedition. Most characteristic was the intertwining of war and religion. The sun dance, being a prayer for revenge, was naturally saturated with military episodes, but these were almost as prominent in the tobacco ritual, whose avowed purpose was merely the general welfare. More significant still, every single military undertaking was theoretically inspired by a revelation in dream or vision, and since success in life was so largely a matter of martial glory, war exploits became the chief content of prayer. Training for war began in childhood. Apart from athletic games, the boys counted coups on game animals, made the girls dance with the hair of a wolf or coyote in lieu of a scalp. On the subject of warfare, the older generation, otherwise little inclined to interfere with youth, turned didactic. "Old age is a thing of evil. It is well for a young man to die in battle," summed up the burden of their pedagogy. There are two features of Crow warfare that deserve comment: the planting of a coup stick and counting coups. The paradigmatic use of a coup stick was for a warrior to mark a boundary. Each of the clans within the tribe had its own coup stick, and the head of the war party of that clan would carry the coup stick into battle. A fundamental principle of warrior honor was this: if in battle a warrior stuck his stick in the ground, he must not retreat or leave the stick. A Crow warrior must hold his ground or die losing his coup stick to the enemy. In practice, there was a complex process each year by which the officers or wise men of the clan would select young warriors who were made to die. A member might decline this honor by saying, "I am afraid I am not strong enough." But conversely, a member might also be tricked into smoking a pipe before knowing that he thereby contracted to take on this role for the season. And some members of the clan would put themselves forward as crazy dogs wishing to die. These were warriors who defiantly courted death, running right up to the enemy in a battle. A crazy dog was paid great respect by the tribe. The planting of a coup stick was symbolic of the planting of a tree that could not be felled. In effect, it marked a boundary across which a non-Crow enemy must not pass. This was a paradigm of courage. A warrior culture will accord highest honor to the brave warriors, and to the wise old chiefs who once were brave warriors. These were men who were evidently willing to risk their lives to protect the tribe. But there is a question of why bravery took on this particular cultural form. After all, everyone who went into battle was risking his life, and there may well have been occasions when the best military strategy would have been to retreat. Why valorize this form of standing fast? Obviously, planting a coup stick may have been of psychological value in rallying the other warriors. It may have served to unnerve the enemy, and thus it did have military value. But there remains a symbolic element that needs to be explained. In planting the coup stick, the Crow warrior was not only risking his life, he was also in effect saying, "Beyond this point, penetration by a non-Crow enemy is impossible." Obviously, there are possibilities that the enemy will move forward, but if the ritual is going as it should, none of those possibilities is one in which the Crow warrior remains alive. That is, the warrior was making a show of risking all his future possibilities in order that this space should be protected from the enemy. Thus, insofar as the warrior is in control of possibilities, he is saying that there is no possibility of a non-Crow's imposing his will upon the Crow. The planting of a coup stick in this way becomes an existential declaration of impossibility, and this has the effect of saying, "There is a fate worse than death." Namely, it is better for me to die in a glorious battle than for the Crow tribe to be threatened by the penetration of the boundary at this point. This declaration was recognized as such by all parties, friend and foe alike. The approaching Sioux enemy knew that the warrior who planted the coup stick would protect that ground with his life. In this way, a culturally embedded form of insistence, "You may not cross this point unless you are a Crow," became a paradigm of courage for the Crow. Once we grasp this paradigm, it becomes easier to understand a derivative act of boundary setting that was known as counting coups. Here is Plenty Coups' account. To count coup, a warrior had to strike an armed and fighting enemy with his coup stick, quirt, or bow before otherwise harming him, or take his weapons while he was yet alive, or strike the first enemy falling in battle, no matter who killed him, or strike the enemy's breastworks while under fire, or steal a horse tied to a lodge in an enemy's camp, etc. The first named was the most honorable, and to strike such a coup a warrior would often display great bravery. The phrase, "to count coup," was used ambiguously to name any of these brave acts, and to name a ritual ceremony after the battle, in which each of the warriors, sitting in a circle, recounted his coups. He then planted a feather in front of himself, one for each of his coups. He was then allowed to wear those feathers, either in his hair or on a coup stick or on his shield. If a young warrior counted coup, he could immediately pick a wife and marry. Otherwise, he had to wait until he was 25 years old. The wife of a coup-counting warrior could ride proudly ahead of her husband in a procession.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?